This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with sculptor Frances Bagley about her long career as a key figure in the Dallas arts community. Frances is in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art, in the National Museum of Women in Washington, D.C., amongst others, but is probably best known for contributions to corporate collections and public art commissions nationwide. At the end of the episode, I'll be taking a look at some of the week's top art headlines. But first up, the pursuit of 3D form with Frances Bagley. Frances, I really appreciate you being willing to sit down on a Saturday morning and talk about your life's work. And so you're not originally from Texas.
No, I'm not originally from Texas. As a matter of fact, I grew up in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. But between Tennessee and Texas, I lived a lot of places, including England and Arizona and San Francisco and Georgia, a brief time in Illinois. So I actually, have had an experience in a broad section of places to live. But I've stayed in Texas by far the longest, and it's one of those decisions that I didn't think I was making, but I realized I had, because when I first came to Texas, I thought, well, this is going to be a couple of years, and now it's probably been over 30 easy.
Right.
But I will say, I think actually Dallas has served me well, and I feel a real strong commitment to this art community and have worked for the community, especially in years past. I ran the Dallas Area Rapid Transit Public Art Program.
Oh, wow.
Early on. I was the developer of it. And then I've taught in several of the universities here, and have really put roots down. I feel like there's something about the Dallas and the Texas, but Dallas specifically, art community that is I don't know if nurturing is the right word, but it feeds you. Mm-hmm. And many people who lived here and moved away say that's what they miss the most, is the support from the other artists.
Right.
There's not a real strong sense of competition amongst artists in Dallas. It's much more about pat you on the back and what can we do to help.
Sure. Which
has been something that I've fed off of and contributed to through my career. So Tom and I are kind of like Safeway, or was some anchor tenant who's been in this town a long time and
right.
have been involved in very pivotal moments in the development of the community.
You talk about the DART public art program. We look back, say 40 years ago, what the state of public arts would have looked like in Dallas in terms of just driving around and seeing public art.
It was zero,
right.
Except for some of the donations that the city had accepted. So when public art began to be an item, an issue in our country, I'm trying to see if I can conjure up the dates. Probably late 80s. Dallas embraced it. And they brought in people from Seattle, and Seattle was the premier example of the development of public art earlier on. And so people were brought in from Seattle to give seminars to artists in Dallas to talk about how to think about trying public art. It was really valuable because Jerry Allen was one of the main people, and he gave us lectures on you have to respect yourself. You have to know that your time is worth money,
right.
And that and that's the way one of the foundations of approaching this sort of endeavor. But then when Dallas did develop a Percent for Art program, I was on the first committee with Nancy Nasher to develop that, the way Dallas's ordinance for public art was written. So I was totally on the ground floor of Dallas public art development. And then when DART needed a public art program, they chose me to develop it. And I did, all the planning and developing of how it would be run, and then actually ran it for 5 years while they developed their starter line.
Wow.
So that was a great experience for me, and I've often worn two hats because I also ran public art programs for, or for projects for various other municipalities, and yet I really am the one that wants to be making the art, so I don't do that anymore. But I certainly know what both sides of that process are, and allows me to be able to handle the bureaucracy a lot better than some artists can.
So you grew up in Tennessee. You didn't go to college in Tennessee.
Well, I did go to the University of Tennessee for a few years. Okay. And then realized that I needed adventure because I come from a very rooted Tennessee family that I wasn't getting away from at the University of Tennessee. Right. And I realized I wanted to be on my own. And so one summer when I came home from college, I thought, how am I going to get out of here? And I found this ad for a ranch camp in Arizona that turned out to be a very illustrious place. Right. But I wrote them a letter, and they flew me to Atlanta to interview me. And turns out I was the only person they had ever hired at that point who didn't have an inside connection. So the ranch camp is called Orm Ranch, and it still exists, and it had, it's a school year round, but in the summer they bring in, kids of very, very important wealthy people go there to have the ranch experience, to learn horseback riding and arts and crafts, and be on this 40-acre operating cattle ranch, and actually, have jobs, collect eggs or groom the horses or whatever. So having grown up on a farm, it was perfect for me. And so I did that for 2 years, I think, but I stayed in close contact with them longer, 2 summers. But all it took was that very first summer, and I was ready to move to Arizona.
Sure. So what do you think it was that made you that first person that wasn't part of the nepotism? Like what set you apart? Was it growing up on a farm?
Well, this is I guess maybe might illustrate it. My mother was, as they called her, a Yankee. My Tennessee family was not, and deep-rooted family. And as a matter of fact, when I first went to the University of Tennessee, my roommate's mother called my mother to introduce herself, and called back and said, "Oh my God, Francis's mother is a Yankee." So I was never, I was always what they would have called a half-breed in a way. I had a lot of, and furthermore, my mother and father both went to the University of Michigan. My father, although his family was deep-rooted, had lived all over as well because my grandfather was in the military. So, my immediate family was always a bit rebellious and different than some of the rest of the family. So I had experience with that. We spent all our summers in my grandparents' summer home in Canada, or traveling around to get there. So I had a lot of experiences outside of Tennessee, and I knew I wanted a broader life.
Right. And so once you made it to Arizona, you figured out you wanted to stay there for a little bit.
Well, I finished school there and got my first master's there. And because for me, the Arizona was like the moon.
Right.
If you compare it to Tennessee with all the intimate foliage, those vast expanses of space, were very liberating and yet confusing. But that was what I was looking for. I was looking to really challenge myself, not only to new people but a new environment.
After you got that first master's, were you going straight into your personal art practice, or were you thinking about teaching? I know you spent some time in England. How did you make that choice coming out of there?
Well, in finishing school, I needed a job, and my mother had been a teacher, and my mother also actually has an art degree from the University of Michigan, so I had that background as well. And so I taught in an elementary school in Arizona as I was finishing my master's. I taught art, and actually to migrant children, which was really cool.
Right.
So anyway, I had already had that teaching experience, and of course the most obvious thing for people with a master's in art is to teach, because that's a job that you can do,
right,
or that is marketable. So I was ready to do that, but I got married in Arizona to my first husband, and he was also an artist, but a ceramicist.
Okay.
And at the time, I was taking ceramics too. My degree is in painting and printmaking from Arizona State and Tempe. But I got very, very involved in ceramics because it was three-dimensional.
Sure.
And the reason I even mentioned three-dimensional is because as a painting student and having been a painter for a period of time, I always realized, or I began to realize, that when I was painting, I was imagining what I was painting in real space.
Sure.
And that was kind of a clue that maybe I'm operating in a different space than the picture plane, which is what I think people have to do if they're a painter. It's
right.
Almost like you have to let yourself enter that world, and it takes intense concentration. You're not in this physical world. I'm a very physically oriented person, and I understood that I wanted my body to relate to what I was making, or even other people's physical experience to relate to it. So little by little, I inched my way out of the 2D plane and into the 3D plane. I had taken sculpture courses, but I was not at all interested in the macho way they were teaching sculpture at that time. We're talking the late 60s. So consequently, I mean, I had remarks made to me like, that's pretty good for a girl. And I began to realize that if you wanted to be successful in the art departments of universities at that point in time, you needed to, your work couldn't look like you were female. Right. It had to look like you were either male or neuter. So you were always dodging. But that was right about the time Judy Chicago did the dinner party. So that was also right about the time that the book The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan came out.
Right.
And it really, both those things and other things really hit me hard. I realized that I had not realized how suppressed, and not just in art, in all ways of life, that I had been, and all we women who are, needing to be ourselves had been.
Sure.
And so I really embraced feminism at that point, and it liberated me, because when I could let my work show who I was, then it totally opened up all kinds of direction,
That transition from painting and printmaking to sculpture, was it gradual? Did you find yourself starting to make reliefs and then kind of figuring out?
It was gradual, but not too gradual. It was. I had all my life made things. As a matter of fact, when I was a little girl on the farm, I wanted a pony, and my parents wouldn't buy me a pony. So first of all, I painted the pony. That's me with my pony in that self-portrait against the wall. That's the pony that I wanted, and that's my portrait. You can see my.
So what age are we talking?
Well, there I'm 5.
Wow.
But then as I got older, I didn't get a pony till I was around 8. I made a pony. And, living on the farm, there were sawhorses and things around. So I took a sawhorse and made a head and a tail and a saddle, and I'd sit on it until I tormented my parents, and they finally bought me a pony.
Wow.
So I was making things, and then whenever there was a high school float, I made the float, or whenever there was even a college Panhellenic. I was in a sorority at the University of Tennessee, so I was, that changed overnight too when I went to Arizona. But I made all the displays that we did for all the football games and everything. So I had been building things, ever since I was a kid. So it wasn't a hard transition at all. It was just a matter of realizing that was the art, not the painting. I mean, what I needed to.
I guess that first work, was it small scale? Was it ceramic? What was the art world's perception of 3D work at that time? I mean, I know Eva Hess was, doing some interesting things with resin and things at the time, but run of the mill, where would you have been starting at that point?
Well, where I started was with ceramics, because that was certainly a perfect venue for making sculpture in any kind of way. I didn't need a crane, I didn't need chisels, I could easily make ceramic sculpture. And interestingly enough, the ceramic sculpture I made early on relates in a great deal to the sculpture, the larger things I do now, with a bit of a narrative to it and a bit of structure as well as organic form. And when I look back, I go, wow, I was doing it then. I left it for a while then when I became a full-fledged sculptor to be more abstract, and I took out all the imagery and so forth. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of your question. But,
no, it's okay.
But somewhere along the line, and actually it was, I could date it, but I was making abstract sculpture, and I realized that I wanted to incorporate something, I felt something was missing for me, and I realized what it was is something figurative, something human that I could work with, because I see now that my message is really about the human being and the human condition. Right. And so consequently, matter of fact, this painting over here above the table was done around the same time, the time that I began to allow myself to put the figure or the organic form into the abstract sculpture. Right. And part of my reasoning was I was kind of lonesome for my girlfriends, which a couple of them moved away, and so I made them. I made these large figures, and this one is called the 5 Women. So there are 5 women in that relief on the wall. Right. And then I also physically made, it took me a long time to develop techniques for my sculpture that weren't traditional, that worked for me. Right. Again, because I said I didn't want to do the traditional sculptural media. And I discovered that if I made work with small bits of things, particularly at that time small sticks, that then I could build big things. Right. I always wanted to make it big. I have a real almost problem with scale. I love scale. I love really, and I have actually a slight problem making things small. Right now, because we have this big space, and I want work big, but at least it tends to be life size or bigger most of the time. So anyway, I figured out techniques that I could use that were all mine that would translate and also not end up with things that couldn't be lifted by me or couldn't be manipulated by me. Later, I had many of those pieces cast in bronze, which helped the marketability of them.
Right.
But and helped the longevity of them for sure.
Sure.
But they were originally made with splintered shingles that then were nail pinned together and formed a structural form that was, though, organic.
But even the way you describe that work then, it sounds a lot like your work now in terms of, I see a lot of forms that allude to the figure. They're like figurative components by themselves, may not even be recognized as being part of the body, but as you start assembling around it, they take on human form and easy to lift. I mean, the fact that I think you use a lot of foam.
I do now, yeah.
Right. And
those early pieces I called vessel figures because I made them as if they were, pots, interspersed in this timeline is a year in England working as an apprentice potter with Michael Leach, who was Bernard Leach's son. And I actually made production pottery to the 16th of an inch. I mean, calibrated to be dinnerware. But and so in making ceramic sculpture, I had also the skill to be a potter. And my ex-husband and I ran a pottery in Georgia, in Macon, Georgia, actually. Wow. And so I was always interested in the fact that a pot has a belly, a lip, a foot, a neck, and all those body parts. At least that's the way they're described. So then when I started making sculpture, I made enormous shapes that were figurative but not. They were some hybrid between a pot and a body with belly and foot and lip and then open.
Right.
But they weren't closed. They were made as a structure, so they were, air flowed through, their visual flowed through, but I call them vessel figures, my very first ones. So then from there went beyond, and I do use a lot of foam because I want it, again, big and light, and I want form, and I want to control that form, and foam is real easy to do that.
So you've been using foam for a while.
Quite a while.
Do you find that it's holding up over time?
Some does and some doesn't. It will for sure if you coat it.
Right.
Then you're fine. But I actually really like the way it looks when it's not coated, so I have to talk myself into coating something. But that's where the line is drawn as to whether if it gets air and sun, it won't.
You go to England, you wind up coming back to Georgia, set a pottery studio. How did you make it to Texas?
Well, and so my ex-husband and I moved from Georgia to Texas for him to teach at North Texas. So we lived in Denton, and I proceeded to get a second master's, this time in sculpture, while in Denton. And that was great. Of course, my husband was part of the faculty, and I was taking courses, which is normal, and people do that. But I felt that I got a lot of opportunity there to do what I wanted to, and to really experiment with things. North Texas was a great place for trying out ideas.
Sure.
And so I got an MFA in sculpture there.
Great. And
then when we broke up and our marriage ended, I moved to Dallas and he stayed there. And it broke up a little bit because I didn't want to use clay anymore, and he was so devoted to clay. He felt in a way that I had abandoned him by abandoning the material. At least that's what he said. So consequently, I stopped using clay and haven't gone back since, although sometimes I think I ought to make us a dinnerware set because I've certainly got those skills.
So at that point, you start making work, sculpture. You're using mixed media of different types to make forms.
And I was teaching full time.
Okay.
I came to Dallas and I got a full time job teaching at Mountain View College, and then I was there a few years and then went to UTD and helped develop that whole art program because at the time they didn't have an art department.
Right.
And there were several of us that were brought in at that point in time, and I don't know if you've heard all the controversy over the fact they lost the art barn and they've been moved into regular classrooms and buildings on campus. But the group that I was involved with in developing that program actually had designed the building with the architects to be an art-friendly structure. It's very cutting edge, won a whole lot of awards architecturally. And so that I spent my next 5 years teaching there.
Right. Great.
But after I left UTD, I did then become a full-time artist. And pardon me, but would teach an adjunct class at various schools in the area, and it was great to keep my interaction with the students and to keep my just there's a real great thing about teaching.
Sure.
That once you stop, it's hard to go back. But I taught a lot at SMU. I taught at Mountain View again. I taught at Richland. I taught at Brookhaven. I did a whole lot.
I know there was work that I saw that you did, what was it called, like Weather Report?
Right.
And that was an installation that you had done where those figurative elements were, really kind of alluded to under everything's covered in cloth, right?
Uh-huh.
And can you
well, they did. I think you were about to say this, but you didn't. But they alluded to classical sculpture for sure. And I do have a very strong affection for classical sculpture. That I remember in my early art history classes, just being so impressed by Bernini, especially because of his ability to create that emotion in the bodies. Although in that Weather Report installation you're talking about, they're rather stiff classical poses. And that was to make a point about sort of the status quo,
right?
Or the structure, the hierarchy of our society. But yes, they're all covered in cloth, and interestingly enough, that installation was done when Bush had just declared war on Iraq, and I was so depressed about it that the whole thing totally changed. It was going to be quite colorful and still with a similar sort of elements arranged not exactly like they ended up, but all the joy had gone out of me, so the whole thing turned gray.
Right. And
so I changed all the cloth to gray and changed a few other things and then titled it Weather Report in a way to try sort of speak of the tone of where we were.
Your process, do you start conceptually, or do you just get your hands on materials and start dabbling and things emerge, or are you responding to...
Well, interesting question, because I often have intention. I think a lot about concept and I'll have intention, but I almost never follow my it's, I'll outline what I think I'm headed toward, but I almost never totally follow it, because for me the real excitement about art is for the art to talk back to me, to say, wait a minute, this is not, you need to try this instead. So the process and well, so I was starting to say that I like to experiment with materials. I like to investigate things, but I do start with intention that is not held to.
Right.
And that takes me off on all kinds of tangents, which I think in career-wise has been a drawback. But aesthetically and creatively, it's been wonderful.
Right.
Because I'm very free in my sense of creativity.
When did you first start incorporating video and media into your work?
Probably in the mid-2000s. Although back at UNT, getting my master's, I did experiment with video. That video was brand new.
Right.
And so we all were going, what can we do with this? So I had a sense of it. And I like video as an element that isn't a story. I don't want the video to take time.
Right.
I want it to be the part of the action at the moment. So I don't usually use video in a way that you have to watch it as a video. It becomes part of the environment or part of the installation or the entire installation.
Right.
So in the mid-2000s, I began, I'm trying to think what exactly, I think my very first large video project was because I was thinking so much about how we are being watched all the time with surveillance. And I thought, is there a way to talk about what that feels like to be watched? So I began to solicit my friends to let me film their eyes. And now I call it a collection. I've got almost 200 sets of eyes. And the criteria was that whoever was being filmed they could see themselves in the viewfinder of the camera.
Right.
So they could keep their eyes centered in the viewfinder. But there could be no nostrils and no hairline.
Right.
And they were to look at the camera, the viewfinder, keep themselves there for 6 minutes and try not to blink.
Right.
Well, that's impossible. But if I didn't ask them to try not to blink, the blinking is unbelievable how much there is in someone's eyes when you film them.
Right.
So the effort not to just slowed it down. Anyway, so I collected these eyes and then mounted the first installation with 7-inch players, and every player was on a stand that emulated or referenced a body, like a soldier.
Right.
Not really a soldier, but like in sort of a regimented composition. So then you got these eyes all looking at you. But what was extremely interesting about that, and I've used these eyes in other configurations since, and it's always, this fact always is true. The eyes are not threatening at all. As a matter of fact, it absolutely reverses itself. You're looking at them. And I did ask the people who were, my friends and others who would allow me to film them, to ask them to look at the picture plane. So there is a point where their eyes are focusing. So it's not on infinity.
Right.
So that's one reason I think it's not penetrating as much as it might, but I'm not sure if it ever would.
Right.
Because that ability for you to look at all these people's eyes is empathetic.
Right.
So it doesn't threaten. It it creates almost a human experience of being able to study someone's eyes.
Sure.
And all kinds of interesting things happen from filming people and using their eyes, in that sometimes they don't even know it's them when they can't recognize themselves when you extract an element from the face and it's not in relation to the other elements. I've had people say, where am I? I don't see me in here.
That's funny.
Or I've had people say, well, those are my eyes. And I'd say, no, they're not. Another thing that's interesting is one woman I filmed, I never thought of her as very pretty at all. Mm-hmm. But when took her eyes away from her face, they're amazingly beautiful eyes. And that all became super interesting to me.
Sure.
So anyway, that was the first one. And I continued to do that. I continued to film people and use them in different ways.
Right.
The eyes. And then I did it with horses' eyes. And
oh, wow.
And because as a girl that had to have a pony, I have a whole lot of relationship to animals, and especially to the horse's eye is phenomenal, and you can't help but look at it, and they look at you,
right,
and they study you. And I had a real hard time finding a horse that wasn't tired, though. I would go to these stables, and they were so tired they weren't relating to me in the way I wanted to see that eye relate. And finally I found a friend I found had a jumping horse, and so that horse was intense and looked at me exactly the way I wanted the horse to, and captured the eyes there. So video continued to be involved off and on in the future. I noticed one of my processes is not to move from A to B to C to D.
Sure.
I work more in a spiral.
Yeah.
Things I've worked with, I pick back up again and do it another way in another time. It's more maybe a corkscrew,
Yeah.
And so I'm not finished with anything.
Right.
It seems, It
reminds me of a conversation I had with Joseph Havel, where he's like, every time someone tries to put me in a box, I rebel and I try something new. But that doesn't mean I'm never going to go back to it. It just means I want I want to move on to something else. But it's just one more arrow in your quiver. I imagine you just figure out how these things keep interacting in new ways and coming together, because there are certain things like foam figures, the draping, the video, that keep coming back up and reconfiguring in new ways.
Yeah, they do, and that's I think that's great. Of course, again, this art world, this art market would rather you didn't do that.
Right. Those are almost two things, different
really
things.
are.
Art world and art market.
Well, and it's up to the artist to decide where they are willing to land.
Right.
What do they want from it? And what I want is that experience between me and it, and letting it take me where it needs to go.
So maybe this is a good time to talk about public art. When did you first get into doing public art in the big commissions?
It's interesting you asking me that. I actually am going to have to really think about what the first one was. But again, in my experience, I had a lot of experience on the ground floor of public art. I have always done large temporary art.
Okay.
That would be the beginning. I built some very, very large pieces in New York over the years at various sculpture parks. And then Connemara here in Dallas, I was early on involved with that. It no longer exists, but it was a sculpture park out in Allen, Texas, that the Williams family and Amy Monnier ran for years, and gave artists all kinds of great chances to try things outdoors. I got a commission when I was exhibiting with DW Gallery back early in the 80s to build a life-size bird for a development, and I did it. The development never happened, but the bird did. So it wasn't life size. It was huge. It was 20 feet tall, and so that was my first chance to really build something big that could be permanent.
Sure.
I mean, I've certainly built lots of things that might not be permanent. So it was made of steel, and I made the model. I know then the second one was, and I didn't get this commission, but I sure wanted it. It was a commission for the city of Lubbock, and I designed a guitar dock for their lake that you could walk out onto the guitar that was 40 feet long, and
right.
and then pull your boat up to the neck of the guitar to reference all the music coming
Sure.
out of Lubbock. So I had several chances to not get it and build models and figure
Right.
them out and learn. And of course, having run the public art, I knew what was involved in what I needed to figure out, like how much is this going to cost, who's going to do this, how's this going to work, etc. So then I still can't remember. Well, when I worked with DART, I got to do the design of a few of the stations. So, of course, I had that experience. But again, the very first commission as a public artist, I'm not sure what it was. But over the years, when Tom and I teamed up, we've done a few together, and then I've done separate ones, and he's done separate ones. But our White Rock Lake piece was probably the one I think met what I would aspire to in public art, which was it had message, it was environmentally sound, it was about the environment, and it was educational, and it interacted with the viewer. Right. And I guess you probably know that it's since been removed because of lack of maintenance on it. So it was there for 10 plus years in White Rock Lake.
Right.
So we called it the Wildlife Water Theater, and it referenced the fact that the bathhouse had a theater, and in the water you could see another group of performers, and
right.
we researched who would perform at what times of year, and there, between birds and reptiles specifically, and made these. And it came about in an interesting way. We went out to the lake to see what we should propose, and I said to Tom, because there were still poles in the water from the swimming that happened at White Rock Lake in front of the bathhouse, and I said to Tom, look how when a bird stands on a pole, it makes a sculpture. Actually, it's a pole with an object on
right. top,
and he said, what if we put 100 poles out there? And then that went into the idea that you could have all these birds, and then we floated discs in the water because that lake is full of turtles.
Right.
And I'll back up. I didn't even tell you this part. In the 80s, I had built a floating sculpture in that exact spot for a temporary project. Wow. And I had built a floating drawing right there, and with wood and so forth and colors, and so I floated this drawing in the water, and it was covered with turtles immediately, and birds. And that gave me the idea that I knew those animals were there to interact with. So that's why we ended up doing it. So our Wildlife Water Theater had marquees on the land, and there were I guess you'd call them signs, but illustrations of what animals you could see perform, and gave you a little bit of their resume,
sure.
like what they look like and what they did, and so forth and so on. In order to install that piece, and in order to maintain it ourselves, which we did for 5 years as part of our commission, we had to buy wetsuits, and we would go out into the water, the water, and clean the poles and clean the lights, because it had an LED light component, solar powered. And the turtles, and some of these are snapping turtles, would follow us in the water like a dog, staying a little far back, but just, you'd walk over here and the turtle would be behind you.
Right.
And they don't bite. And we learned a lot about wildlife. They don't bite in the water at all. They might have bitten us on land or attacked us or something if we annoyed them.
Right.
But on the water, they never did. They just followed us.
Wow.
It was pretty amazing.
So tell me about collaborating with your husband. What is that like?
Well, it's very interesting and very time-consuming. I had collaborated for years with a group we called Toxic Shock, a group of women, before Tom and I were even together. And we made several noteworthy works of art and even were featured on some level in a show the Dallas Museum did several years ago to talk about the history of the Dallas art community, because we 5 women really had a beautiful collaborative process that was very intellectual and very satisfying, in that we did things that not one of us would have done by ourselves.
Right.
We only together would these works of art have been come to fruition or even come to a thought. So anyway, I was very prepared to collaborate, and I'm not sure that Tom was, but for some reason I guess he saw the benefit, because as a married couple, as a couple, we are a team. We divide tasks. We even, talk about division of labor is one of the secrets of marriage.
Right.
Because if, you handle that, I'll handle this, we'll communicate, we'll discuss, then we'll plan. And so that's what collaboration is. And we even built a house together, which is really one of the hardest things to do. Right. Designed and built, and we're our own contractors. So we have had.
They say if your marriage can survive that, you're on solid footing.
Right, and we know that, so we know that we can do it. So working together is actually just good sense, because I have skills that he doesn't. He has skills that I don't, and so you put them together and you get even more from the team. But people like for us to work together, for I'm not exactly sure why, and so we've been asked to do things together almost more than we want to. Right. Because we don't want to become just a team. We each have individual things to say and careers and art to make that is not collaborative.
Absolutely.
But our very most important collaborative project was the Dallas Opera's 50th anniversary production of Nabucco. Right. And that was just an amazing experience. When the opera came to us and said, would we want to do this, I think almost all artists, especially three-dimensional artists, but I bet painters too, because I know David Hockney's done it. All kinds of great painters have done sets for productions, whether they're opera or dance or something else. And I think both of us in years past have daydreamed about doing that. But there's a huge learning curve if you're doing something for a production that's established. Right. And so that was our response. There's too much to learn to prepare for this actual production of Nabucco. And they said, oh no, well, we have a technical person that will figure all the technical aspects out and will hold your hand in your designs to be sure that they can be translated. Right. Well, that's all we needed. Sure. I mean, that was dynamite, because this guy was brilliant, wonderful, patient, fabulous.
Sure.
And as artists who had built lots of big things ourselves, we were not daunted at all by the idea of designing these sets. It was right up our alley, and just worked beautifully. We also said to the opera, we don't know a lot about opera. We've both been to the opera. We have some concept, but we're not opera buffs. And they said, oh, that's actually good,
right?
Because you'll bring something new, and you won't feel bound by what's been done before.
Sure.
So we watched every production of Nabucco that we could find in film and video, and knew immediately what we didn't want to do.
Right.
We felt that every production had the same problem, and that was that in this opera Nabucco, there are so many people on stage at the same time that you've got to first separate them somehow so you know who they are, and you've also got to elevate them, because you just have a whole bunch of people on the floor of the stage.
Right.
It's just a mess. And even the Metropolitan didn't do what we did, and so we were really proud of ourselves in terms of designing sets that were modular, would turn into lots of different things in an abstract way, and that elevated the various characters when they were on stage together, so that and also color coded them with light, so you would know who was a Hebrew and who was a Babylonian because of what they were wearing, or what color light was on them, or how they were interacting on the set, etc. So it was a super experience for us.
And so when the opera came to you, did they encourage you to be as contemporary as you wanted to be? I mean, is that, in my mind, one of the decisions a company would need to make is, hey, can we breathe new life into a 150-year-old piece about something that happened 3,000 years ago, saying, how can we make this look and feel contemporary? Right?
Well, yeah, they certainly did imply that we could go in our direction. And at the time, they had a director who had done this in Europe a lot. And so consequently, she done it with artists. And so she wanted to try to implement that here in Texas. Now, they haven't done it again with artists, so we're not sure that in the long run they appreciated the avant-garde or experimental nature of what we did, because they've gone right back to where not totally. Now they're able to do a lot of video projection in the new theater.
Right.
We were still at the music hall, so you couldn't do that, some of that technology. But anyway, yes, they gave us an open-ended charge, and we actually found that the theater, having been a visual artist all these years, there's a difference in the aesthetics of theater, which was very liberating. We felt that their aesthetic was much more open-ended than a visual artist aesthetic, because we're taught as visual artists to own our aesthetic and to put parameters around it. This is within the boundary that I work as an artist. But when you're doing theater, you have to go in whatever direction works.
Right.
So when we would try things, they were almost more open to it than we know a visual criteria might have been. Like, for instance, when we came up with the idol for the Babylonians, the ball. I'm trying to think. Yeah, there was another word that went with that. But anyway, we tried many things. I even made bulls and various things. But in the opera, that he has to be destroyed. And so we needed to figure out how to destroy him without them having to rebuild him every day, or whenever. So having worked with all these taxidermy animals that I've collected, I had a squirrel, a skin plug, they call them, just the form of a squirrel with no detail. And he was exactly the right size for this large model that Tom had made. Tom is the expert model builder. So I painted him gold and stuck him in there and said, trying to actually shock them a little bit to see how far they'd let us go.
Right.
I said, I'd like to see something real organic and almost grotesque here for this idol.
Right.
And they loved this thing. and because you really couldn't tell what it was. You had no idea. And we would never tell until the opera was finished that it was actually a squirrel, because people thought it was a gecko or some lizard or whatever. And so, of course, we didn't build these sets, and that was great. We supervised them being built with a set company. But so they carved life-size, 12 feet, this squirrel, and then made a half impression in fiberglass, so that this is an opera trick or a theater trick that we learned from them. By painting the half shell of a translucent material, gold, and shining light on it, he was gold. When you shine light behind it, he turned transparent again. So that's the way we destroyed him, is the lightning struck and the light shined from behind instead of from in front, and he became transparent, and all you had was his skeleton in there.
Wow.
And so that was very effective, and we were really excited about that part of it.
Have you been approached to do any other theater design since then?
No, we haven't, and we would have liked to.
Yeah.
We were disappointed in a way, that because we would have liked to have done more.
Right.
It was really a very intense and exciting experience.
So, are you working on anything in this studio right now? Like, are you working towards any shows, or is it really public art that's on?
Right now, public art is the primary focus. Always looking for possible exhibitions. As of the last few years, I have decided not to be affiliated with a gallery because I've realized it's not fair to the gallery because I'm not interested in making work that sells right now. I've certainly done it in the past and been satisfied by it, and but I don't want to feel like I need to make a certain kind of work for them, which is only fair.
Right.
And more galleries, though, are willing to show experimental work. And at some point I may again, affiliate with a gallery. But right now I want no sense of obligation beyond myself, because I'm needing that time to, get back into another direction, or no, that's not exactly, not another direction, but another body of work.
Got it.
That doesn't need anything imposed on it.
Where can people find out more about your work? Where can they find you?
Well, that's a good question too. Well, certainly at my website, which is not totally up to date, but has a good cross section of work from the past. And I'm starting to post on Instagram, which seems to be the new way that people really know what other people are doing. And I think I've got Francis Bagley Art, where personal things are going on another site, but I'm only putting art on that one. And I have some permanent work around the town of Dallas and in Japan and a few other places, but I'm not real easy to find, and that's an interesting question. Makes me admit it.
So what is your web address? Is it
It's francisbagley.com.
Okay, so francisbagley.com, and we think Instagram is at francisbagleyart.
Yeah.
Okay. I really appreciate getting to sit down and talk to you about where you've been and where you're going. And I really appreciate you taking time out on a weekend to have a conversation.
Well, thank you. You've been real delightful to talk to me.
Thank you. And now, the news. It may sound counterintuitive, but galleries specializing in NFTs are beginning to pop up around the world. The art asset is natively digital, but the world still has a desire to see art on walls and own something that can be tangibly displayed. That's why I'm a big fan of Canva. And that's why we're starting to see legacy art world dealers begin to create new spaces just for NFTs. The most notable announcement thus far is an offering from Nagel Drexler Gallery. The Berlin space will open in January with a show from the art world polyhyphenate Kenny Schachter. The project is currently slated to be called Crypto Cabinet. The legendary Dave Hickey, who is known in art circles as the bad boy of art criticism, passed away on the 12th of this month at his home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, succumbing to heart disease. Dave was opinionated, bombastic, and purely Texan, which made him an unexpected harbinger of taste in the art world. He wrote for every major art news outlet and was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship. His critical essays were published in 2 volumes, 1993's The Invisible Dragon for Essays on Beauty, and 1997's Air Guitar, Essays on Art and Democracy. The latter, Air Guitar, is considered by many as the finest work of art criticism ever produced. His writing would deviate from the linear task of analyzing paintings and travel down side topics as diverse as TV families, sports, politics, and outlaw country music. If you have an opportunity, pick up one of his books, or search for one of his many tape discussions that you can find on YouTube. PBS has recently released a new episode of its documentary series Secrets of the Dead that shines a light on the theft and recovery of the Caravaggio painting St. Jerome Writing. The painting is a historic piece of the Caravaggio puzzle. Caravaggio had fled Rome after the murder of Ranuccio Tomassoni and sought exile in Malta. There he hooked up with the Knights of St. John and was even inducted into the order himself. He hoped the order could help him get a pardon from the Pope. It was during this time that he painted St. Jerome Writing, as well as the beheading of John the Baptist, which is arguably one of his greatest works and the only painting he ever signed. Caravaggio stayed put in Malta until he again got in an argument with another knight, busted down his door, and injured him with his sword. So that's the story of the painting. Then there's the story of the theft. It turns out that these 2 paintings that I just described still lived in St. John's Co-Cathedral in Valletta, Malta. In 1984, 2 thieves arrived in the afternoon, paid admission to see the exhibit of historic artwork, and made their way upstairs to the gallery that housed our pal Jerome. They then placed a work in progress sign in the doorway while they removed the painting from the wall and cut it from its frame. The painting was then rolled up and dropped from the window to the sidewalk below. They then calmly left and picked up the canvas on the way to the getaway car. I'll let the documentary fill you in on the rest of the details about the thieves' inability to fence the painting and how it was eventually returned, but let's just say that the museum director had to take matters into his own hands to locate and return the painting more than 2 years later. It's Miami Art Week, which means the art world is gathering this week in South Florida to gawk and be gawked at. Art Basel started organizing its U.S. version of its iconic art fair back in 2002, and the event has outgrown everyone's expectations. It's not just Art Basel Miami Beach that will be taking place this week. It's also countless parties, exhibitions, projects, and other art fairs that reach a variety of different audiences. In Miami Beach, these include Design Miami, Ink Miami, the Satellite Art Show, Scope Miami Beach, and Untitled Miami Beach. There are at least another 8 art fairs going on in the greater Miami metro area, including Art Miami. The festivities began yesterday and run through Sunday, December 5th. If you're headed to Miami, have fun, but watch out for variants. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe, and while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. If you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read a transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.